Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the second day of the hearing session on Matter 7. As this is a resumption of yesterday's session, I don't propose to run through all the housekeeping points again, but before we start the discussion, can I just remind you to keep your comments concise and that you should really only be making comments on matters and policies that you have already made written representations on. Are there any housekeeping points that either the programme officer or the council need to raise with me before we start? Mr Bedford?
Thank you, Madam. There's one minor matter left over from something we were looking at yesterday, which relates to the footnotes, and I'll ask Mr Hobbs to just explain the position on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Bedford. Yes, ma'am. We were talking yesterday about policy LP19 on landscape and how there was a different footnote in the version that had gone to the council meetings for Baber Mid Suffolk in mid-November. And in between the council meetings version and the version going to the professional designer for print, footnote 37 got amended incorrectly. So it was effectively repeating footnote 36. So what the council would like to do is reintroduce footnote 37 as a modification as per the version that was published for the council meetings.
Rightio, yes. That's fine. Can you just add that text to the schedule?
Sure.
Mrs Feeney?
Inspector, just to let you know that Mr Short from Artisan Planning has put his apologies. He won't be joining us this morning.
Right, that's great. Thank you very much. We'll now turn to policy LP25 on sustainable construction and design then. To the council, I'd just like to ask, you suggest on page 25 of your statement, on bullet point 1 for this policy, that in principle you agreed to amending paragraph 1553 for the expiry of the zonal charge, but nothing has been put forward in either the statement or the schedule of suggested modifications. So that's more, it's more of a bit of a housekeeping point that I need to we need to see that put in.
Yes, thank you, Madam. Yes, I assume you don't want something on the hoof now. It would be something that we just need to pick up on.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's been highlighted that you propose that. It's just something that needs to be picked up and the wording put forward. And also, I note that you've made a suggested modification to paragraph 3F, and I agree that is needed and improves the clarity of the wording. Is there any comments from any of the participants on that wording of paragraph 3F that's been suggested? Great. Then can I just ask if the council could explain the apparent discrepancy between part 3B and part 6 of the policy with regard to the water efficiency standard, and whether perhaps part 6 might be better just in the supporting text if it's just more of an aspiration or suggestion.
Well, Madam, if I perhaps start on that. Certainly the distinction between the two, we hope the language is clear enough that 3B is what development is required to do if it's residential development, whereas 6 is setting out, as you rightly said, an aspiration to effectively do better than the 110 litres per day and aspire to achieve 100 litres a day. So far as whether the latter should be, as it were, relegated to the supporting text, I think, well, paragraph 16 of the MPPF obviously talks about what plans should aim to do, and then obviously A is prepared with the objective of contributing to the achievement of sustainable development, and then B, be prepared positively in a way that is aspirational but deliverable, and then D, contain policies that are clearly written and unambiguous, so it's evident how a decision maker should react to development proposals. I think our approach has been to sort of reflect on the point that generally the supporting text should be to explain the policy rather than to set out additional matters which are expected by the policy. So I think that's why we thought it was better to be upfront and to put 6 into the policy itself. But given that it's not intended as a requirement and it is intended as an aspiration, I don't think we're, in a sense, enormously troubled if it was deferred to the supporting text. I think it's really just a question of approach. I say the MPPF isn't entirely clear in its guidance as to what you should or shouldn't include in terms of aspirational elements, should they ever be in a policy if they're only aspirations. So I think we probably welcome some guidance from you as to what you think is the appropriate approach. But as I say, I don't think we're, as it were, too concerned. We just want and sense it to be clear that we do have that aspiration because it will help on the achievement of sustainable development.
Mr. Birant.
Thank you, ma'am. Wouldn't disagree in terms of the wording, which does clearly say that it is to encourage, but I think our concern really in terms of the decision making is that you've got an aspiration and the requirement within the policy itself, and I think it is that confusion that can be had in terms of the decision makers as to which one it should be, and it's really just trying to remove that and making sure, really, as paragraph 16 does, is that there is clarity within that policy, and by moving it out of the policy and into the supporting text, it doesn't remove that there's an aspiration there. It just makes sure there's clarity in the decision making as to what applicants are required to do, and so there is certainty within that, ma'am. So just a different position. Understand where Mr. Bedford coming from in terms of that, but I think it does create a far clearer policy with it being not relegated, ma'am. I wouldn't suggest that, but being placed within the supporting text. Thank you.
Thank you. Lady Hart.
May I respectfully disagree with the House Builders Federation? I'm sorry, I couldn't remember the name of the speaker, and support the council in having part 6 in the policy. In reality, when matters come before the planning committee in officers' reports, they sometimes quote the policy, but I've never seen the supporting text quoted. So, and it does clearly say in part 2, residential development is required to, and part 6 says are encouraged, and indeed it has further qualification of wherever feasible. So I would have said that the members of the planning committee should be able to clearly discern between a requirement and an encouragement. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cook.
Thank you, ma'am. Not to go around the houses on this point, but I would support Mr. Berendt's position, but maybe a helpful observation more than anything else, in that paragraph 15.53 already of the supporting text already does include the words will encourage all residential development to achieve 100 litres. So it is already in the supporting text. It's just your view, I suppose, as to whether it belongs in the policy, but I'll leave that for you, ma'am. I won't protract that point out any further.
Mrs. Payne.
Sorry, I was just lowering my hand because Mr. Cook had raised the point that I was going to say about 15.53 and whether there was a bit of additional clarity that could be added in there. But again, we'll leave that with you.
Right, yeah. Right, well, I'll consider that further. Mrs. Payne, can I come back to you though, because I know that you've suggested wording needs changing with regard to 3D, I think, and I wondered if you could explain that.
Was it 3D?
It was with regard to the building regs, I think.
Yeah, it was just a general point. I suppose this picks up on the conversation just now in terms of what is required and what is aspirational. And it was really the point that obviously building regs still provide more energy efficient buildings than the existing housing stock. And in order to provide clarity and to future-proof the policy, the suggestion we had made was whether actually it's reworded so that new development meets with building regulations. So you take out and you reduce down the text. Really, it's not diluting what text is requiring, because it relates back into building regs anyway. So it's saying building regs should be met in terms of CO2 emissions, water efficiency and energy efficiency, but also where those standards and regulations are exceeded, that will be supported by the council as well. And it was just trying to provide that consistency between what is already happening under the building regulations and then what could be achieved under this policy as well. So it was just a suggestion there really within our regulation 19 representations that might help in terms of clarity and consistency of applying the policy.
Thank you. Mr. Stringer.
Thank you, Ma'am. Just wanted to slightly push back on why we should go above what is the standard building regulations. When the building regulations were initially going to be staircased up so we became carbon neutral, that was due to happen by 2016. And the government just before that time had what they called a bonfire of regulations, which did slacken where the building regulations were going to go. We have now signed up internationally to say that we will cut our CO2 emissions, and the government does allow us to go above building regs if we've substantiated the evidence. And all the evidence from the eastern region and from Suffolk is that our per capita CO2 emissions are greater than those in the rest of the country. Therefore, we are perfectly justified in seeking to go above current building regulations in terms of efficiency of houses. And also we are able to do that because of our statistics on people that are locked into what is known as fuel poverty. So anything we can do in that to go above those regulations are already substantiated in current government policy and should be encouraged to bring us in line to what we've also internationally signed up to and probably about to sign up to at COP26. There were a couple of is it okay if I go on to some of the other issues we have with the policy, Ma'am? Or did you just want to stick on current building regs?
Well, I know Mrs. Miller wants to come in, so
that's fine.
She may want to be on that point. So
I'm happy to disappear and let others carry on. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you. Mrs. Miller? You're on mute, Mrs. Miller.
Thank you. I just wanted to make the point that if you remove this clause D, you actually make building regulations the maximum rather than the minimum. So I would suggest that having a greater aspiration would be a good thing to do.
Thank you. Well, I'll have a look at that wording. Then part 4, I wonder if you could explain to me how that would relate to outline applications. Sorry, that's directed to the council.
Thank you, Madam. I think the approach there is that the content of that statement will obviously have to reflect on the nature of the development which is proposed, and obviously there will be certain things with a outline application which won't be known at the outline stage, and it may therefore be appropriate for the statement to make it clear what is intended at the reserve matter stage to deliver on those requirements. And obviously the decision maker, having looked at that statement, will then have to decide whether what he said is sufficient or not. I mean, obviously, Madam, as you will know, it's the developer's choice when framing their application to decide which matters should be dealt with at the outline stage and which matters should be reserve matters. It's not necessarily an either or, because people can submit details of elements of what would otherwise be a reserve matter at the outline stage. And if they choose to do so, the local authority can't then reserve that matter, because you can only reserve a matter where details are not contained in the application. And I say developers may have a completely a variety of approaches, and so we think that it's appropriate to require the submission of the sustainability design and construction statement, and then quite what the content of that is and how it demonstrates the principles set out in the preceding parts is achieved will be a matter for, in a sense, case-by-case evaluation, depending on what's actually submitted. So I think that's how we see it working. So I don't know whether Mr. Dawson wants to come in with any further comments on that.
No, I think that's quite sufficient.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Cook.
Thank you, ma'am. And I obviously just listened to what Mr. Bedford's just said, and I should be clear in the outset that my client is not objecting to obviously the principle of submitting such a statement, and we obviously recognise the importance of the issues that it covers. The concern is that point 3, I know we're talking about point 4, but it relates back to point 3, and point 3 is very explicit in what it requires. So it is all new residential development is required to. And then if you skip to part C, it's required to demonstrate climate change adaptation and mitigation measures by adopting effective design principles, including, and then included in the brackets are landscaping and site layout, building orientation, etc. And our concern is that these are clearly matters of detail, landscaping and layout being matters that can be reserved. And if you are at an outline stage, and those matters are reserved, I would struggle to see how you would do that. I take what Mr. Bedford said in so far as I could submit a sustainability and construction statement that sets out that I will lay out my site to maximise solar gain, etc. But my concern is I suppose the absolute wording of point 3, in that I must demonstrate that, and I would submit to you that I can't demonstrate that, ma'am, at outline stage if those matters are reserved. And my recommendation to address this would simply be to amend the opening sentence to part 3 to be worded similar to all new detailed applications for residential development are required to, and then go through those detailed matters. And then point 4 could be tweaked. Well, point 4 does already cover all major developments, so it's not only detailed applications, but it would just be clear that outline applications go through the same hurdles, but only require the higher level commitments, as opposed to being required to demonstrate those matters of detail.
Thank you. Mr. Bedford.
Thank you, Madam. Yeah, just to come back on that point, which I say, I think we're all trying to achieve the same outcome. It's just the tools that we use to do it. It's not unusual for with outlines save for means of access. That's quite a common experience, that the developer does require to fix the points of access to a site at the outline stage. But that can then have implications for site layout. because obviously the access point is a key component to then considering site layout. And if 3 was confined to applications for detailed permission for residential development, then the position could be that at the outline stage, because access has been fixed, you have then constrained the layout in such a way that you can't then optimize either layout or building orientation to achieve, in particular, those objectives at 3C. And so I think what we wouldn't want to see is, I say, a rigid approach which, I say, limits what can be considered at the outline stage. I think, I say, we've made the point that what you had to submit under 4 would obviously have to then reflect the nature of the application that was put forward. If we needed to look further at the wording of 4 to clarify that point and to make it clear that the sustainability design and construction statement should have to demonstrate so far as practicable given the content of the application, etc., we could look at doing that. But I think we'd be a bit concerned to lose from 3 the fact that it applies to all new residential development, because that's where it's got, as it were, teeth. And then I say 4 is then delivering on that, depending on obviously the nature of the application.
Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Mark. Only briefly to come back and say, if 4 was tweaked, as Mr. Bedford just said, to say words to the effect of it as far as is practicable, then we would accept that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stringer.
Thank you, Mum. Just wanted to say to reiterate that often we get an outline application that always includes the access, and often the estate roads, if it's a larger, are laid out in that, and that determines orientation of the buildings. So that really needs to be in part of that thought process as well. So the two need to be umbilically linked. Just a small item of housekeeping under C. It should be solar gain, not gains. There's only one sun. Thank you, Mum.
Right, yeah. Lady Hart.
Chiltern Parish Council would like to support, and I personally would support the council on the wording of criterion 3 and 4's presently worded. We are experiencing the 2 largest housing developments in our parish recently were both bare outlines, access only, and indeed on one of them a subsequent access was introduced later through a construction management plan which hadn't been part of the outline and was done through a condition, not so the public weren't consulted on it at all. So I think it's important that all new developments do have these requirements imposed on them. We get master plans, and then when it comes to the RMA application, it's completely different. So that, the development committee may believe that although an illustrated master plan is obviously not binding, the eventual development that comes forward can be completely different.
Thank you. I'll consider that wording and see whether we do need some amendments just to consider the issue of outlines or not. Part 5 of the policy, Mr. Brandt, I think the HBF, you've suggested that this should be in the supporting text rather than the policy, and I just wondered if you could explain why.
I'm not sure whether that was. If it is, I apologise. BREEAM is, I think, it applies to to industrial rather than to house building. So I'm not sure. I apologise if it was me, but I don't remember. Let me have a look at my reps. Sorry, ma'am. No, I only mentioned about the sustainable construction and design in terms of part 7 and the 100 litres. So sorry, I can't comment on
Sorry,
on the BREEAM standards. Apologies.
No, I must have picked up something wrong there then. Mr. Stringer.
If I may, Chair, the Mid Suffolk Green Party submitted a submission to suggest that even as far as this policy goes now is possibly not far enough, and that we should possibly explore going even further. For instance, considering almost banning the use of gas central heating. That sounds like a radical and a large step, but if you unpick that slightly, that's probably not as radical as it seems. The government is clear that you cannot buy a gas boiler in the first half of this plan period, and more importantly, within the first half of your mortgage. So if you cannot buy a replacement boiler, and all these new houses are reliant on gas, you've got a substantial amount of investment to make on these houses within that mortgageable period, and mortgage companies will be aware of this, which means there will probably be, like there is with thatched properties, an element of them not allowing certain mortgages on these properties. And it would be bitterly ironic if these brand new, wonderful, shiny new houses come to market and mortgage companies are putting premiums on them because they'll need to be retrofitted with quite a lot of engineering. Now, the current government's policy is suggesting that we can possibly rely on hydrogen to sustain the gas pipeline infrastructure. In fact, they had a report, it's not part of the tabled papers here, tabled in August, but a UN report in late August then trumped that policy to say that frankly was not going to work. So the government, parts of the government and parts of the trade are suggesting that hydrogen could well be part of our heating future. At the moment, there is very, very little peer-reviewed evidence to say that could happen. So suggesting that we seriously discourage the use of gas in central heating here is actually could well be a marketing tool, as well as making these properties more mortgageable in the medium term. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you. Lady Hart. You're on mute, Lady Hart.
Apologies, Mum. I would support Mr. Stringer on that proposed amendment. We had a recent planning application for the Chiltern Woods site, and gas boilers were being proposed for housing development, which won't start till 2023. And we were being told that that gas boilers were going to be outlawed in 2025. So there was a lot of local opposition to gas central heating going into the first phase of housing. And the planning officers said to the development committee that whilst they were entirely sympathetic to that point being made by a number of objectors, there was no negative condition. So there was no negative provision in any policy, so they couldn't oppose it. So if that is right, then in light of that application and what happened, where people were saying it should be ground source heat pumps, if it's a requirement in order to for the council to oppose an application that there's a negative provision in a policy, then I'd strongly endorse Mr. Stringer's suggestion based on that practical experience. Thank you, Ma'am.
Mrs. Miller.
Thank you, Ma'am. We have exactly the same position in East Burgolt. We have a recent application which has been processed and is in the course of being built, or just about to be built, and the developer was encouraged not to use gas boilers, but indeed is using gas boilers because it's a price point issue. So support with a policy would give Baber much stronger force in advising the builder to think for the future rather than just for the current pocket. Thank you.
Is there anything the council wish to say about that?
Thank you, Madam. Madam, I think we would be concerned at effectively a plan-wide prohibition on the use of gas boilers for all of the proposed dwellings. I mean, there's a number of points. First of all, the viability appraisal hasn't worked on that basis. So there would be an unknown question as to what the implications would be. Secondly, there could be, and without obviously engaging in consultation, one wouldn't know, but there could be particularly implications for the delivery of affordable housing or lower market products catering for those in need of market housing, but at the, as it were, the lower end of the market. So far as the concern about mortgageability and the implications for home buyers, I think we would expect that the house building industry collectively, so I don't mean just the Home Builders Federation, but also obviously individual developers, are obviously alive to the issues of needing to build houses that they can sell, and therefore needing to know that mortgage finance is available for the products they put onto the market. So I think we would expect them to, as it were, evaluate the type of issues that Mr. Stringer was referring to, and no doubt there may come a point of time where those who build houses don't see it as being in their interests to do so. But obviously the government has set out a phasing out programme with a phasing out timetable. That timetable doesn't bite as yet, and so that's, in a sense, that's the steer that the government has given. So those are the I think our primary concerns is, one, the unknown or knock-on consequences of a total prohibition, and secondly, that we would think that the market is capable of being informed as to the financial implications. And obviously, the third point is more a matter that it will be up to individual developers when they're looking at the criteria in item 3 to decide how they want to achieve those requirements. And that could well include, for particular types of developments, using alternative sources of energy supply, heat supply. And there could be developments where ground pumps, heat pumps are appropriate. There may be others where that would be more of a constraint, particularly in terms of smaller sites or infill urban sites and so on. So I think we think that we've got the balance right. I'll just bring in Miss Dawson if there's anything particular that she wants to add to that. Oh, and just lastly, could I just say I just noted while we were looking at item 5 that there's a very minor typo in item 5, in that I think the very last line, that cross-reference, instead of saying 2B, should say 3B.
Right.
But I
Yes,
say
because there's no 2B, is there? So,
no.
Right.
Yeah, but that, I say we can pick that up. But so I'll just ask Ms Dawson if she wants to make any further comment on an approach which would prohibit the use of gas boilers for any of the proposed housing stock.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bedford. At the end of the day, the policy aims to bring in as much sustainable construction design that is considered viable and obtainable for all. Central government I appreciate and acknowledge that the gas central heating systems are sort of wanting, and the aspiration is for them to be phased out. But they haven't really established an achievable approach for this for us as a local authorities to be able to champion. There's as a conversation the other day was sort of like adhered to the fact that someone who's got a air source heat pump exceeds the demand of available energy to that dwelling if they wanted to include an electric charging point. So that means that if we put in something that restrictive within this policy, we would have a knock-on effect with wanting to also encourage electric charging points. And in the best will of the world, it'd be great if we could sort of like put that forward. But if it then makes that dwelling actually unachievable as to actually be a dwelling and to achieve everything that's required, then that makes this policy ineffective. So until there's a reasonable alternative technology available that can be championed, and that the central government can roll it out and go, yes, okay, this will actually meet the needs that's required, and the energy demand for that development or the dwelling, the cap doesn't get breached, then we can review that when that level of support from central government has come forward, and we feel that that is actually a viable criteria that can be introduced.
Thank you. Mr. Berent?
Thank you, Mark. Actually, Mr. Bedford and Ms Dawson have made the points that I would make in terms of deliverability of such a requirement. We are working as an industry with government and with providers to create the markets to allow provision to happen along the government's guidelines with regard to future home standard. So I think it's something that we are all working towards, but we need the markets to be in place and the people to fit these and all the other elements that need to be in place before they can come forward. Without impacting on the deliverability of schemes coming forward between now and the future home standard coming into place. So I think I would agree with Mr. Bedford and Ms Dawson with regard to their position on that. Thank you, Mel.
Thank you. Mr. Stringer.
Just want to pick up on 2 points, if I may, Mum. A high percentage of the homes identified in this joint local plan have no gas supply. So they will have to use what the council is wrongly referring to as alternatives to gas. The use of the word alternative assumes that gas is the norm. It is not the norm for vast amounts of the houses and the land identified in this plan. In fact, gas in the constructions, certainly within 5 to 6 miles of me in a radius, gas is a very, very expensive alternative. It means you install like a bomb in your garden and a tanker comes along and pumps the gas into it. That's very, very much an alternative. So it's wrong to suggest that there is no alternative. There is. The alternative was rolled back on by government. frankly, and to suggest there's not enough energy supply to accommodate this move is also wrong, because if the houses were passive by design, they wouldn't even need the heat pump. And if they did need the heat pump, all the more reason why the developments should then have enough installed capacity for energy generation, i.e. the orientation correct so solar panels can be used and battery storage used within these, which is the clear direction of the market, as it were, then this could very easily be achieved. So just wanted to check that the use of the word alternative to suggest using heat pumps and electricity and solar panels, etc., is not an alternative. Gas is not the norm for many. Also want to push back very slightly on what people want, that houses that are built are almost bespoke by the people wishing to buy them. All of the market research, certainly we did at the county council level, involved in a company called Barley Homes. We tapped on the doors of 6 developments and asked the homeowners what they felt about the design of their homes. And actually, all the evidence we got there was it wasn't being built to what the market demand, that the market was buying what was built. And I see little evidence to suggest that's incorrect. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you. Well, I'll give some consideration to that. Mrs. Payne, I think I'm right that Pigeon have raised some concerns regarding the viability data being out of date in this, and that true cost hasn't been considered. Is that something you want to pick up on?
Yeah, it was as I say, it was just picking up on the whole plan viability study at ER02 core document, and obviously, like with some of the other policies, it has identified that this policy will have a high impact on viability. So listening to the discussion just now, obviously, anything in addition to that needs to be reviewed, and it was just a case that the viability study has taken the figure of £3,500 from the Energy Saving Trust. So that was a 2006 figure. And it was just whether, again, the robustness of that figure is correct in today's market. From Pigeon's viewpoint and experience, it's probably, I think they put in there, it was between 2,500 and 5,000, and actually probably the cost per dwelling is nearer to the higher end of that, so nearer to the 5,000 point. So it was just really sort of putting that in front of yourself and the council to consider whether, again, I know we had a similar conversation around this in matter 5. Excuse me, I can't remember the policy that it was in relation to, but we were having a similar conversation around that as well, and just as I say, the evidence base and making sure that that is robust and doesn't have an impact on obviously delivering these important housing schemes.
Do you have any other figures that you consider should be used, or at all?
No, it was coming from practical experience, so more so than actually having a figure that I could point you to in research at the moment.
Yeah. Mr. Hobbs?
Thank you, Mum. I just wanted to point out also in that viability study, so we were talking about pages 42 and 43 of the PDF document that's in the core document library as ER02, where there's a table 4.1 which refers to the policy costs, inputs and assumptions, whilst Ms. Payne refers to policy LP25 as £3,500 per dwelling. There's also reference there to policy SP10, which we talked about yesterday on climate change, with a further £2,557 per dwelling. So I think in considering what we've discussed, we almost need to take those two figures together and the report itself does identify that there could be an element of double counting there. So I think just want to reiterate the whole plan viability that we've probably actually gone over and above the £5,000 that has been referred to.
Thank you. Mr. Bedford?
So, Madam, yes, I was just going to, without rehearsing the debate we did have earlier, I think last time we talked about viability, but you won't overlook the point that I think we've previously made, that what you can't realistically do is just adjust, as it were, one element of a viability appraisal. If you were to look at updating, you need to update not only the cost side of things, but also the revenue side of things. And obviously, that's not an exercise that anybody has attempted to do, but you shouldn't only look at, I say, the cost side of the equation. So but that's a point we've already made.
Is there any other comments people want to make on this policy before we move on? No. Right, we'll move on to LP 26 then. And my first question to the council is to do with the optional technical standards that this policy requires, and in the light of kind of footnote 49 of the NPPF and what the PPG says about the need to gather evidence to justify setting the optional technical standard. I want to ask what evidence you have of the need to apply this. I've taken on board your comment that all homes provided by permitted development have to meet that, but I want to know what evidence you have to support applying it to everything else.
Thank you, Madam. I think I'll bring in Mr. Hobbs on the evidential justification for the council's approach.
Thank you. I think also in addition to your point, Madam, about permitted development, also affordable housing delivered also meets these technical standards currently as exists. I think the evidence that, as we sort of touched on under matter 5 around the M42 requirement, we have evidence for homes needing to be accessible, to have the right space to enable people to reside in these homes throughout the lifetime of their these homes are sort of built for life effectively, as was what we were touching on before. So I think looking at the demographics and the needs of our population do justify why we require homes to be built that effectively can be lifetime homes and to meet these optional technical standards.
I mean, have you got a history of developments providing inadequately sized accommodation?
Yeah, in some instances, some developers do provide below the minimum standards, and I know that can be a matter for our planning committees. And what we're trying to do is ensure, like I say, that these homes are built to the appropriate standards. Like the government's put the technical standard there, we believe we've got the evidence to justify it, and that's a sensible approach going forward. And we believe the market can deliver this size and can sell the properties appropriately. So
the evidence is simply your demographics.
Well, and the needs, as we touched on before, around without rehearsing what we discussed in matter 5, but effectively what the strategic housing market assessment is telling us about our future needs.
Mr. Brandt?
Thank you, Mark. From what the council is saying, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that it's collected with regard to recent developments or developments that have come forward that are below space standards. There seems to be a suggestion that the applications have come forward, but this hasn't been presented in any evidence to you, ma'am, which is what is required of this policy to justify their inclusion. I think there's all other elements in terms of justification, in terms of saying actually what is the impact on starter homes with regard to the space standards as well, something that the council hasn't looked at, but which is referred to in planning practice guidance. So I think it's important that the NPPF requires that justification. PPG requires that justification. That justification needs to be there. That there is an endemic problem with regard to space standards within this area. I think in terms of those space standards, there are times when space standards can't be met, and actually you can provide a more flexible offer to again meet people in terms of starter homes and first homes that can afford those houses. So there are sometimes need for that flexibility. And there needs to be, but then quite clearly in NPPF needs to be a justification there. This is justification the council just haven't provided.
Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Ma'am. I'd just like to echo what Mr. Brent has just said there, really. Mr. Hobbs refers to evidence, but I echo that no evidence has been submitted to you, Ma'am. And Mr. Hobbs refers back to matter 5 in the session there and the discussion we had on M42 standards. But my recollection of the conclusion of that discussion was that the council need to go away and do more homework on that matter. So I would suggest it's a bit unwise to rely on that here as justification for the space standards, when the conclusion there was that the M42 standards were not evidenced and the council needed to go away and relook at it. And again, from memory, there was a discussion about how long that would take, etc. I can't remember quite what was agreed, but I think we were all very much aware that it was not an insubstantial piece of work. It was quite an amount of work that needs to be done in that regard, and I would suggest it's the same with the space standards, ma'am.
Thank you. Lady Hart.
Ma'am, I can give you some oral evidence and I can supply that to the council, although they should have it available to them, of very recently on Chiltern Woods, the house builder developer there put forward on their RMA application for the first phase of housing. There were some housing which was below the minimum space standards. That was objected to and the developer said they would alter it. But to begin with, they did put forward a proposal that was below those standards. Thank you. And that's very recent, ma'am. That's, this year.
Okay. Mr. Stringer.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just offering some. There's not this evidence within your bundles, but certainly when we did the research on 4 developments. By tapping on the doors and asking, that was the single biggest issue from those that had bought these new houses. Frequently we heard the term, I really don't like living in a rabbit hutch. If you're going to build some houses, can you make sure that we are not living in a rabbit hutch? The space was critical to those that had already bought. It prohibited them working from home often because they couldn't convert spaces easy to be homework offices and whatnot. And equally, we have recent evidence of a development in Elmswell that after it got its outline approval, it came back with another outline approval to change the design. And the change in design, the developer argued, was to make them more affordable, but it did drop them below the national space standard. And what happened was the development was then approved with the below the national space standard, and that very afternoon that developer's website then had a price increase on that model of house by £20,000. That's happened within the last 6 months. So there is this, I have a post bag of people that want housing and particular housing. As a councillor, I have never ever had someone beg for me to have a smaller house or something that was under, the clue is in the name, national space standard. I think we should aspire. There's no evidence that people in Suffolk or Mid Suffolk are smaller than anyone else, that need less room than anyone else. has less families than anyone else. I think we should be setting the bar as high as we can and not constantly trying to dip under it to the lowest common denominator. Thank you, Ma'am.
Mr. Stringer, that when you said you did some research and people said they didn't like living in rabbit hutches, I think was your phrase, were those houses that were they in houses that were below the minimum space standards?
Yes, they were.
I mean, I've heard the kind of debates on both sides, but I do think this has to be, the NPPF and PPG is quite clear that this needs to be justified. I don't think I have that evidence to justify that at the moment, and I think the council needs to provide that. As Mr. Cook was quite right. I mean, like the M42, it was agreed you needed to go back and do more evidence, to, provide me with evidence to justify that 50% figure. And evidence needs to be provided. You know, I need to see what's coming through in terms of the size of developments. You know, how many are falling below this standard, and to be able to justify this, putting in this requirement, because it is clear that it has to be clearly evidenced.
Well, Madam, we've noted that, and obviously we note the previous discussion under matter 5, and that is something that we're looking at, and obviously we will continue to look at that.
Yeah. So there's my other questions. I did ask, I raised a question in my about the design codes, but I don't and use of design review panel app. I've read the statements and I've got no further questions on that part of the policy. In terms of 1F, I think obviously you've suggested a modification to remove part 1F because it's not consistent with LP06, which we talked about under matter 5. And I agree that needs to be removed from this policy. I would like to look at part 2K. I note what the council statement says, but I want to be clear how developers will know when part 2K is going to be applied. What is a suitable location? I think, you know, you said it will only be a suitable location. Well, what is a suitable location? Is there some need for the supporting text to provide some guidance on when this might be, so that developers are, you know, are clear on when it's possibly going to be applied?
Thank you, Madam. I think I'll bring in Mr. Hobbs, who's been looking at this issue, and I think we've also noted that the footnote 43 at the moment is a link to a document which I think has been superseded. There was a 2017 document produced by the RTPI, which is what the link had referred to, but since then I think the RTPI have updated their document. So we would need to update that reference and make sure, effectively, if we're using links in the final version, that it's a link that works. But I'll ask Mr. Hobbs to comment on the...
Just looking at that, Mr. Bedford, there's actually 2 footnote 43s.
Indeed, there are, Madam. There are. That's another matter that we need to look at.
So yes. I think you mean probably what should be footnote 44.
I think that's right, because the next one does seem to be 45.
Yeah.
So that looks like an editorial issue as well. So the second 43 we need to look at both in terms of its numbering and in terms of its content. But coming back to your point, Madam, if I ask Mr. Hobbs just to comment on how we see Part 2K working by reference to the sort of the guidance that is available on what should be done to accommodate dementia-friendly development.
Thank you. And if I can just illustrate as well, in terms of the core document library, this is document D26, which is the RTPI Dementia and Town Planning Guidance from 2020. And I think we're always trying to say there, where appropriate, obviously some of this depends on the sort of location as well. So enabling people with dementia to be able to walk to services and facilities. So there needs to be that degree of services and facilities available in any case. So that's one point, but also in terms of dementia friendly properties as well as the outside design, the RTPI documents are helpful in that, in identifying what things need to be addressed. And as you say, Marm, perhaps it's beneficial if we add an additional paragraph in the supporting text just to explain that a bit further about what we actually mean in the policy.
Mr. Clare?
Thank you. I just want to say that County Council are supportive of the policy point on dementia-friendly design, and we'd be happy to see an additional explanatory paragraph. I would just like to add that if you look at the RTPI's guidance, it's they're quite clear that it's very much a wider placemaking issue. So where dementia-friendly design principles should apply, I would argue they should apply in most places. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I said, so if you can just look at possibly a paragraph to just support that, just to explain it a bit more, I think that would help to provide clarity. I know some others have made some detailed comments on various points, which I will consider when I'm looking at this policy. I don't need to particularly raise any specific questions on those, but is there anything else anyone wants to raise on this policy? And Mrs. Payne?
Thank you. I won't take up your time too much because obviously it is in our written representations as well, but it's the clarity, and I know I keep going on about clarity, but in regards to point 2E, and it's just
sorry, was that 2E or 2E?
Yes,
2E, yeah.
that's echo. And it's the second part of that criteria really, and just understanding when that will come in. So I appreciate, obviously you've asked the question about the design review panels, and I've noted the council's response in their matter statement that they aren't needed, or design codes, but within there it is saying that schemes of exceptional design. So my first point is, this isn't defined. Are we talking about paragraph 80 in the NPPF housing, for example, or schemes, or is it something else? Within a sensitive area or landscape, again, quite a bit of ambiguity about when that might be considered appropriate, but that those types of schemes will be required to undertake a design review, so that it is in adherence with the Building for Life criteria. And I think it's just understanding, is that a design review as part of a planning application undertaken by the applicant to assess against Building for Life criteria, or is it something that the council would be doing as part of the planning application, and therefore what is the mechanism for achieving that, and does that cost come back to the applicant if it is through a more formal means? So I have made these points in our representation, but it was just to try and articulate that a little bit further, as to whether there's the possibility either through footnotes or through use of the glossary in the local plan to explain when that criteria is likely to come into play.
Thank you. Is there anything the council would want to say particularly in response to that?
I think, Madam, we'd certainly be content to look at whether one can expand in the supporting text the type of factors that would lead to an expectation of a design review. And I think certainly we would expect that if it is required, we would expect that to be something that the developer, as it were, absorbs the costs of undertaking that. That's I think what we would see, but I think we can certainly look at trying to expand probably 1556 and to sort of clarify what the expectations are in that regard.
Thank you. Lady Hart?
Ma'am, following on from Mrs. Payne's comments and referring back to your question, which was paragraph 712B about design codes and design guidance, and the council's answer that they didn't think they needed a design code. Chiltern Parish Council feel very strongly that applications should be subject to the design guidance, and indeed possibly since this latest version was published, the government have published, as I think it's supplementary planning guidance, but Mr. Bedford will probably be able to help us on that. They've published design model codes which are applicable. So I find it very surprising that the council's just brushing off the need for both. The independent review is normally conducted by a REBA appointed panel, so there is a mechanism under the design guidance and the model code, and I would strongly urge the council to be requiring designs, at least a major developments, to adhere to those. And indeed, just recently we have on the Chiltern Woods, there wasn't the developer was not adhering to the design guidance, which requires about 10 specific subjects to be dealt with. And Baber and the developer agreed that it should go to an independent review, which it has done. But the Suffolk existing code is way, way out of date. It's 2000. Thank you.
Mr. Stringer?
Thank you, Ma'am. Just wanted also to reiterate our request under policy 2F that there possibly ought to be a line, and I don't want to use the term I said I didn't want to use, which is word encourage, but I think that's as far as we can go with this particular policy. But we certainly would like to encourage building materials to have low embodied energy. You know, we've all signed up to needing to address our carbon use, and certain materials have a very, very high inbuilt carbon emission in their bringing about, concrete being one of them. But equally, we need to encourage materials that have high embodied carbon, such as timber. And I have encouraged this before at committee, and someone once asked me, well, if you're going to use just low embodied carbon and high energy and high embodied carbon, what on earth's that kind of development going to look like? And I told him it would look just like Lavenham, because that's precisely it. The use of local materials within these buildings can actually help with local distinctiveness, as well as address this huge problem we have with inbuilt emissions energy emissions into the materials we're using, including some of the transport, and equally encouraging that use of materials that have high embodied carbon, i.e. timber. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you. Is there anything the council want to say on what either Lady Hart or Mr. Stringer have said?
Thank you, Madam. I think I'll bring in Mr. Hobbs to comment on the current position in relation to Suffolk's design guidance. But just on the point about the national position, Madam, as you will know, there is the National Design Guide and the National Model Design Code, which have been issued by government. Because they're issued by government as guidance in that form, they're not supplementary planning documents. because those obviously emanate from local authorities, as you will know. And obviously they are referred to in Chapter 12 of the MPPF with guidance given as to their role in making planning decisions. But as I'll turn to Mr Hobbs so that he can perhaps update in relation to the Suffolk design guidance approach.
Thank you, and also just want to reiterate as well the policy makes allowance for encouraging the building for life criteria as well that we've previously touched on. In terms of Suffolk Design Guide, I acknowledge yes, the current or the published one was 2000. However, there is an entire website devoted to Suffolk design, and there's a project where local authorities and partners have come together across the county to look at how we deliver good growth, and by ensuring good design becomes part of everyone's life. So there's some guidance, inclusion, collaboration, capacity, and cooperation. It's all detailed on the Suffolk Design website. I appreciate it won't be in the core document library, but for example, talking about streets as an example, there's a Suffolk Design for Streets document that's going to be adopted by Suffolk County Council, or was going to Suffolk County Council's cabinet in October 2021. There's progress has been halted a bit by COVID, but there are measures going on to update the approach to design.
Thank you. Is there anything else on LP 26? We'll move to LP 27 then. Now I note that Chiltern Parish Council have mentioned that they're concerned that paragraph 1A focuses on mitigation, but consider first, and the policy should try and avoid harm. Have the council got any comments on that?
I think this is a policy which is, as it were, supportive of particular types of development. I think we have seen. I mean, there is some reference and benefit to taking a consistent approach to our language, where we've dealt with in a number of policies the issues as to how you address harm and whether avoidance.
Hello, thank you everybody. We resolved the technical difficulty we've had with YouTube, and I can confirm all is working. So we'll go live again at 11:15 if you'd like to put your cameras on and rejoin the meeting. Thank you.
Well, it is now 11:15, so I will resume the meeting. For those, for the benefit of those on YouTube who may have missed a slight bit, whilst I understand there was a bit of a power outage, we were discussing part 2 of policy LP 27 and whether this needed to be could be dealt with by condition or just by obligation, and whether it needs to be in the policy. And the council had just explained that they didn't think it needed to be necessary. They didn't need to be prescriptive about whether it was obligations or conditions, and they were explaining where the time period of 6 months had come from. Mrs. Payne, you were wanting to come back on the comments.
Thank you, Mum. Noted, obviously, what Mr. Bedford and Ms. Dawson have mentioned there. I think, and as it's set out quite clearly in our representations, my point that I'm advocating is actually whether that is even needed, that part of the policy, and again comes back to something that can be dealt with as part of the planning application on a site-by-site basis, looking at its merits. So that's kind of the first point that I'm, or the position I'm advocating at the moment, but taking on board what the council have said, then if it is to remain, and that's your view as well, then it's just looking at the flexibility point of view and whether, as I say, it needs to be quite as prescriptive as it is at the moment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I will consider whether I consider that that part is necessary or not, and if I do, then I will have a look at the wording of it. Is there anything else on LP 27 that any people want to raise before we go on to LP 28? No, so LP 28. And my first comment on this to the council is just a consistency issue with part 1C and SP10. 1C says that it's developments must conform to the holistic water management, and where SP10 says it encourages and promotes its principles. So I just would like views on that.
I think we probably just need to take that away as a point to look at to achieve a consistent approach, because the strategic policy and the local policy should really be giving the same message. So I think we probably need to just look at that and make sure that we've got it clear.
Thank you. And in part 7, oh, Mr. Cloud, did you want to come in on that point?
Yes, just to say that I would support if the wording in the strategic policy was a bit stronger than encourage. If you look at, I believe it's document D07 of the core document library, it does show that Suffolk is a water stressed area, and so I think greater consideration is needed in development on how water is used within developments and not just as an issue to drain away, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll get the council to have a look at those two policies. I also wanted to raise in part 7, where it says all proposals must demonstrate environmental policy measures and require a CEMP. Is it really all proposals? I mean, like even like kind of small extensions and things like that. I just wanted to check that are required to have a CEMP.
I think, well, small extensions probably would be covered by permitted development rights, but in terms of whether there should be some recognition that there might be forms of development which have no implications for water resources and infrastructure. I suppose we can look at whether there should be a carve out for those. I mean, obviously, in a sense, anything which involves built development and or surfacing, i.e. outdoor surfacing, could have implications, particularly in relation to foul and surface water flows. So to that extent, it is fairly all-embracing, but whether there should be some limitation to recognise that there are potentially forms of development which don't have any water implications at all. Perhaps we can just think about that.
Yeah, I accept in terms of water implication, but it's requiring a full kind of CEMP, which can be quite a big document, or on for a householder application or something like that. I just obviously they would be required to look at their water resources, and drainage, but it was that issue as well, kind of like that if it can be looked at.
Yeah.
Mrs. Payne?
I was just going to suggest, in terms of trying to assist on that point as well, is whether that's something that can actually be clarified via the validation checklist for planning applications, as well as to when that KEMP is required to be submitted with an application, rather than again sitting it within the policy. That might be clearer. But that was just a suggestion as the discussion was progressing there.
Thank you. Something for the council to consider. Mr. Stringer.
Thank you, Ma'am. Just wanted to make a comment on 4, where it says development will be supported where it separates foul and surface water wherever possible. I can't think of a circumstance where you would put surface water into a foul sewage by design. It frankly doesn't happen. You have historic properties, older properties that may have a combined sewer and rainwater system, but those are also, very frowned upon by the water companies, as our own experience of where this has happened, where we get sewage, literally sewage in the streets, yet we have the water authority saying they can't do anything about it. So I can't think of a circumstance where I would want that to be possible, to have surface water going into a foul system. Certainly with the 1 in 100-year events, water events that we're now getting coming almost every year in terms of deluges, that's to be that's an even greater issue that we need to avoid. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. I hadn't got any other questions on that policy other than what I've received in the written statements. Is there anything anyone else wants to raise on LP 28? Yeah, Mrs. Ives.
Morning. I'm picking up on Mr. Clow's point, and I think that this particular policy, especially 2, needs to be stronger, I think, in how we look at. I know I keep coming back to intensive poultry units, but they are massive users of water, and I pointed out in my it's Appendix C of my submission on the examination matters and questions that the water cycle study states, section 4 states that the Anglian Water Resources Management Plan shows a regional supply deficit, and goes on to say that potential sustainability reductions and recent non-residential developments mean that limited water is available for development sites not already taken into account in the published WRMP. And whilst the water cycle does recognise the eye airfield growing agglomeration of food processing industries has led to high growth in water demand, but nowhere does it make any comment on the expansion of the feeder sites that are required to supply that factory with its products. And I think if you look at this, you take the birds out of the equation and you think of those feeder sites as a large network of manufacturing plants. They're producing raw materials as a core component part for a finished product. They're operating on rapid turnarounds and just-in-time delivery to the factory. The factory, the raw materials are assembled or disassembled in this case. They're packaged, they're distributed to wholesale and retail chains. That's the nature of this business. And each of those sites, each of those manufacturing sites consumes thousands of litres of water. And it produces each of them produce thousands of litres of wastewater. And so this policy LP 28 somehow, I think, needs to have some way of recognising in applications, planning applications for this type of development, what the impact will be on water resources and what the impact will be on waste water capacity as well. Just as an indication, sorry, one more point, one indication, and again, it's in my submission in Appendix C, but the current production rate of 1.4 million birds a week at throughput at the factory generates 12 million litres of wastewater per year. And that does not exclude the wastewater that's generated by the factory itself. And then if you look at, aside from that, there are other poultry manufacturers who are doing exactly the same thing. So I think it is essential that we have some way of recognising that in this policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Wellson, did you want to come in as well on this point?
Yeah, I'm not going to mention chickens. You'll all be relieved to hear. I'm sorry, my screen's just gone. I noted what Sue noted, that on the statement of common ground with Essex and Suffolk Water, it says ESW is, however, unable to provide water in the current water resource management plan period for new non-domestic processing activities. And in the spatial distribution documents circulated statement by Mid Suffolk, next to Stradbroke and every other site in the area, it says why not more, why not less, which I have to say I watched that Matter 4 hearing. It was very entertaining. It says potential water supply capacity constraint at Hartismere Water Resource Centre. So we're already, Stradbroke encourages development, as we keep saying, but we can't encourage too much more, and neither can the areas, because there is a potential constraint of the Hartismere Water Resource Zone. So I am concerned about the fact that the policy doesn't cover anything to do with non-domestic use, and I don't want to get to a point where the domestic houses can't come forward that we've proposed or that other people have proposed because there is a problem with the water supply, and I'm not sure this policy goes far enough. So I'm not a fan. I don't know how to put it right. I'm sorry.
Mr. Hobbs, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, thank you, Mum. It's just a few points. So if I touch on the water first, the homes identified in the plan can come forward, and the point of the statement of common ground is identifying, as has been pointed out, there are capacity issues around non-domestic water where there's high intensity of water users. So that's why we've outlined in policy SP08 the need to upgrade from 2025 to the Hartismere water supply infrastructure network. And Essex and Suffolk Water will also be producing, another water resource management plan to therefore address what investment they need to enable the capacity to be increased. And on that point also, just bringing back to the Statement of Common Ground ES11, Core Document Library Reference ES11 with Anglian Water, where we talk about the capacity from the wastewater point of view of water recycling centres. Again, there's capacity to address what currently exists. And likewise, they have their 5-year water resource management plan, which currently runs from 2020 to 25, that they'll obviously be reviewing as well. And for Anglian Water, they were also working on a drainage and wastewater management plans as identified in the Statement of Common Ground that's expected in draft in summer 2022. So I suppose the point I'm just trying to make, I suppose, reiterate, we do work closely with the water companies, and they're well aware of potential, water issues on the horizon, hence why we've put in policy SASPOA, particularly around the water uses, as has been pointed out. So I hope that provides some clarification.
Thank you. Mrs. Veldon, did you want to come back?
It's just something that occurred to me, that all of this planning's going on, and and yes, they're looking at the houses because the houses are in the plan, and yes, but I can't find anywhere in the plan or anywhere in the sustainability appraisal any mention of the potential increase in the size of the factory and therefore the supply chain. So it's lovely that they're all planning for the houses, but there's no mention anywhere of potential increase in industry of this particular type that uses a lot of water. So I am concerned, having just listened to Mr. Hobbs, and I do appreciate that we have the Statement of Common Grounds, but there's no reference in any of the documents that I've read about the proliferation of these intensive poultry units and how much water they use and how much wastewater they produce. And it's almost like it's going to come up and hit everybody, and everybody's going to suddenly go, oh. And as I keep saying, we have a plan that we could do something with it now, so it doesn't come as a shock to everybody. Cranswick are not hiding the fact they want to increase their capacity. It's in their statements. I've had somebody tell me that, and I've minuted it. It's in a parish council meeting minutes, that they have plans to double the size of the factory. Now, as the first one was built without an EIA, we can't do anything about that, but we do need to plan for the fact that that factory could get twice as big as it currently is. And therefore, all of these things, we need to look at them now and say, have we got the capacity? Have we dealt with it? Have we put enough conditions in this plan to ensure that the development that Mid Suffolk want, and that I can only speak about Stradbroke, that we are encouraging actually happens, because we're not being overrun by somebody else taking all the utilities and the facilities and everything else. And that's what concerns me, is there's no mention anywhere in this, despite the fact that we have been saying constantly this is on the horizon.
Thank you. Is there anything the council want to say further to that, or do you just want to leave it to me to look at?
I think we're largely content to let you decide, Madam, but I think the view we take is that LP28's criteria do make it clear that if development proposals come forward, they will have to, in item 2, consider their impact on water resources and the capacity of the water supply infrastructure. So that means that the issue will have to be addressed in relation to water resources and water supply. And then 3, includes requiring engagement with the relevant authority regarding wastewater treatment and capacity within the foul sewage network, etc. So both of the issues which are of concern to the parish council and to Mrs. Ives are captured by the policy. It's not for the policy at this stage to dictate what the outcome should be. It's quite clear there are water supply pressures in the districts, and so it may be challenging to know how the proposals would be able to come forward. But since that's a problem that will be assessed and addressed at the development management stage, and that we think is the appropriate place to do that.
Thank you. I've heard both sides, and I will give that consideration when I'm looking at the policy. Lady Hart.
I was just going to add to that debate with that Chiltern Parish Council consider that the policy does need to be strengthened, like I think the Suffolk County Council and Mrs Ives and Stradbroke Parish Council. We think it also needs to be expanded to deal with construction as a practical example. And I know I keep raising these, but it's how it shows where there are gaps in policy. And I know this is the emerging plan rather than the existing plan. But with regard to the Chiltern Woods development, which is 1,150 houses, we're in discussion with the developer about the CEMP. And one of the issues we've raised are what are they doing to save water during the construction process? And what use of non-potable water are they going to make? And the answer to that is none. They use mains water. Their response was that, and I'm just looking for my notes, that we could possibly collect in a week what we use in a day. And we as the parish council said to them, that's not acceptable. We're in a water stressed area. You could be using non-potable water for wheel washing and damping down dust and soil from the construction processes. But their view is they don't need to do that. So we positively would encourage some provision that deals with a positive requirement on developers during the construction process to use water saving methods. And perhaps I could ask the council, when they're looking at the wording of the policies, they could consider that, please. And we would also, with criterion 2, we think considers doesn't put much of an obligation on any developer, and it should be at least demonstrates. Considers is we think the equivalent to Mr. Stringer's encourage. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah. Well, I'll consider those matters, as I say, when I'm looking at that policy. But unless there's anything else, we'll move on to LP 29. Now, I note the suggested main modifications from the council, which relate to part 3 and part 7. Are there any comments from others on the wording of those suggested modifications? Should I consider them necessary? Mr. Miller? We've got a problem with Mr. Miller again, Mrs. Feeney.
Yes, Mr. Miller has been able to speak at the beginning of the meeting.
Pardon.
Oh,
sorry.
Now.
Very sorry. Thank you. I'm guessing that the amendments you just referred to are in Baber's hearing statement. Are they in there?
They're in the schedule of changes that they've put forward. They're ST 16 and 17.
Okay, I don't think I'm going to be able to find those, but
they are also, I think, Madam, in the hearing statement.
Right.
They're on page 19 of the hearing statement
Thank
as well.
you very much. Oh, page 19. Thank you. Thank you very much.
did you want to make any comments on them, or did you just want to know where they were?
I just wanted to know where they were, and I'm just having a quick read of them now. Thank you.
Rightio, thank you. And Mrs. Payne, I know Pigeon have made some suggested revisions. Could you explain, would you want to explain those and why you consider they're necessary for soundness?
Yep, that's absolutely fine. Thank you for that. It was in relation to part 5 of the policy. It refers there in terms of how on-site surface water drainage will be managed and not increased elsewhere, and completely agree with that, and that's in accordance with the NPPF. But it also at the end there goes on to specify that it will include that those putting applications forward include impact of minor developments, and I think it's just whether that's necessary, because obviously as part of this policy, all new development is having to demonstrate that it won't have an impact off-site or on other areas, which will obviously apply to minor development as well. So it seems to imply in here that it therefore shouldn't be a requirement on developers of other schemes to take in that cumulative impact, that it's being done on a case-by-case basis. All minor developments will be looking at that, as well as those for major developments as well. So it was just really sort of how that might play out. And in terms of part 8, it specifies further details of maintenance and adoption by an appropriate body provided at the application stage. Again, I suppose it's maybe indicative details, for example. It's something that changes, we find, on a regular basis with the county and highways and drainage terms, as to it's always an evolving situation as to what they will take. The acts and the legislation behind that dictate that as well, so that's absolutely fine. But also we find that particularly with outline applications, they may not want to look at that until a more detailed stage. So it's sometimes hard to actually be able to identify, particularly for outline applications at the initial stage, who will be taking on the maintenance and adoption as well. So again, it tends to make an appearance within conditions, drainage conditions specifically, and maybe that might be that it's best placed to sit there rather than having to provide that detail up front, because again, it can be difficult to do that at an early stage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is would the council like to respond to that?
Thank you, Madam. I'll bring in Mr. Hobbs in a moment if he wants to add any further comments. On the point on paragraph 5, I think or part 5, the issue was to, in a sense, make it abundantly clear that even smaller scale developments would need to be considered as part of the overall approach. So it was just, in a sense, highlighting something which, albeit it's implicit in the previous sentence, it was, in a sense, drawing that out in order to make it explicit and apparent to people. And then so far as 8 is concerned, I think there's a similar point about wanting to take, as it were, a holistic approach to flood risk and drainage matters, and so therefore wanting that to be considered at the application stage, albeit that, yes, one could understand that there may be some details which may not be able to be specified at the application stage, and no doubt those would be the subject of a condition, whether a reserve matters condition or otherwise. So then I'll just ask Mr. Hobbs if there's anything he wants to add in relation to those 2 points.
Yeah, thank you. The only point I really wanted to make was that cumulative impacts are an important factor that need to be taken into consideration, hence why we've put them into that paragraph, point 5 rather.
Mr. Clow?
Thank you. Just wanted to sort of agree with the comments from the district council there, and that, you know, on point 5, it's obviously, as Ms. Payne says, each application will need to consider its own drainage, but it's just to we think that wording from a Lead Local Flood Authority point of view is helpful in making that explicit, that even the minor developments that can cause cumulative impacts need to consider their own impact on flood risk and vulnerability. And also on the site management plan, take the point that the detail may be different depending on the type of application that comes forward, but we think it's helpful to have consideration of that early in promoting holistic water management practices. Thank you.
Mrs. Payne, do you want to come back?
Just briefly, those answers were really helpful from the county and the district, and I just wonder whether actually then, as a suggestion, there is obviously agree that minor developments also need to consider their impact. It is cumulative, but whether actually within that sentence it still works to say that this includes the impact of minor developments, so that it's clear that they are also, well, it's making that point that it's explicit, as Mr. Bedford said, that minor developments are also required to consider their impact on drainage.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the council could just look at that wording and see whether there needs to just be a bit of tweaking, really, to make it clear.
Thank you.
Are there any other comments on this policy? Then I haven't got any more questions. So I think that's all the policy. Oh, Mr. Miller.
Thank you. My bar was slow to put my hand up. Thanks very much. From my concern about the local environment, I very much welcome policy LP 29 with its sequential approach and so on, and I find that very good. And I'd like to check something in point 2, areas at medium or high risk from flooding. It looks to me as if I've read the sequential approach list in the flood risk, the strategic flood risk assessment, and those medium or high risk zones don't appear to include areas of surface water flooding that have a documented history. I may be completely wrong. They may indeed include surface water flooding, but I don't think so. I'd like to know whether the sequential test, and particularly the exception test, will be applied to these known surface water flooding areas, and indeed to marshy land, which we sometimes see on valley bottoms and valley sides.
Thank you. Can the council clarify that at all?
I think, in a sense, irrespective of what might be in the strategic flood risk assessment, I think national policy in the MPPF, and as supported by the PPG, makes it clear that you need to consider flooding from all sources of flooding. So that would include surface water, pluvial, I think it's sometimes called, rainwater flooding, as well as fluvial flooding. I don't think you need to say anything further in the policy. what is at risk from flooding will include all sources of flood risk, because that's what national policy and the PPG require. So therefore, criterion 2 will require all of those issues to be addressed.
I want to mention that although surface water flooding is recognised, it's actually defined in the strategy document as flooding resulting from high rainfall, which is fair enough, but it doesn't recognise that the same flooding can arise from springs and streams. And when I say streams, I don't mean the ones that are mapped on Ordnance Survey maps. I mean the ones that the ones that sometimes that flow continuously across some valley sides down to marshy ground. I suppose it comes down to point 2, the term medium or high risk from flooding. I don't know what could be done about it, but I'm a little bit worried that medium or high risk from flooding might, why we don't just say at risk rather than medium or high. Otherwise we'll get into arguments. And I'd like to also come on to I feel there's something unsatisfactory there. Perhaps I'll have to bring it up under the site allocation issues. I'd like to just come on to the question of SUDs, which is particularly, and I'm very glad that that amendment has been put in to section 3, avoiding or mitigating. And I'm very glad to see the word avoiding. So I'll go on to point 4. No, I'll just make my point a little bit more on that question of assessment of areas at risk. Very often we see in planning permissions a statement like subject to satisfactory reports of flood risk or satisfactory reports of water disposal or this kind of thing. Can I check, is that something that would only be included? Is it, it's a difference between saying we want evidence on this issue before we give planning permission. There's a difference between saying that and, on the other hand, saying we give planning permission subject to the developer providing satisfactory reports. I take it that the latter is more applicable to areas where there is no known flooding risk, but that where there is a known flooding risk, LP29 thankfully says that it has to be considered in advance of giving planning permission. But how sure can I be that this thing of giving planning permission subject to reports will only really apply to any areas that have no appreciable flood risk? Am I right in hoping for that? Am I making myself clear?
No, I'm getting a bit lost really. What
Sorry.
you're saying the
Okay.
plan needs to do to
Well, it's very
I'm
good.
considering what it needs to be
Yes.
sound, and I need to know what you're saying.
It's very, LP29 is very sound in that it requires applicants to provide a lot of information for the planning decision to be made. Good. And yet, quite often in planning permissions, we see the words, planning permission is given subject to satisfactory reports being received. And this means that there is no further opportunity for the public to make representations on that whole topic. Now, I hope that this latter recourse to saying that we don't need to see any flood information before we make decisions, I hope I'm right in saying that that would only happen in an area with no flood risk. Is there any worry that policy LP29 would in practice be bypassed by an approach of we'll give the planning permission subject to reports coming in? If that's not clear, I'll withdraw it, but I think it should be clear.
Mr. Bedford, is there anything you want to explain? Can you explain that to Mr. Miller at all, whether you think the policy covers that?
Well, I think the policy is intended to work on the basis, as criterion 2 sets out, that in areas of medium or high risk of flooding, it has been soundly demonstrated that new development or intensification of development can be made safe for its lifetime. So that is the policy to be applied to the planning decision, which is coming forward for consideration. And clearly it's expecting the sound demonstration that there will be no adverse flood implications to be demonstrated before the planning decision is made. So I don't think we're seeing this as something which would be deferred after you've granted a planning permission. This is something that would be taken into account prior to the decision to make or to grant or not grant planning permission.
Thank you. That's helpful. It is actually helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Clow, do you want to? Sorry,
Yeah.
Mr. Clow wants to come in as well.
Oh, I was just wondering if I could sort of provide clarification, but if Mr. Miller feels his questions have been answered, I'll lower my hand.
Thank you. Right, so
sorry, I muted. I'm very sorry. If I can just raise a point about part 4, SUDS. I'd like to point out that SUDS is widely seen as an answer to many things. And for instance, here it says that it will provide multifunctional benefits, including biodiversity. The council may be aware that there's research has been published showing that SUDS, in most cases, does nothing for biodiversity. It provides sometimes polluted water. Provides water on unsuitable land for biodiversity. It clogs up with the most common species, which some people with garden ponds may know. So I just want to make the point there that that the fashion for SUDS, whereby it's seen as an enhancement on housing developments, you know, as a mitigation, as a environmental benefit that will justify the idea of biodiversity net gain and enhancement. It's not an enhancement, and it may be to landscape. Now, and the others, I would prefer that biodiversity actually wasn't included there. But I will assume that the council are aware of this research that I'm referring to, and I'm aware also that this is more or less inbuilt to government policy and thinking. So my words may be going off into space there, but I did want to make that comment, and I would particularly like to question the value of SUDs on land which is already marshy, is already waterlogged. Marshy and waterlogged valley bottoms are unable to absorb more water. So therefore, SUDs does not achieve. Unfortunately, SUDs is seen as a panacea in planning. In that instance, I would say it's wrong to rely on SUDs, and SUDs may not be grounds for saying that a development can go ahead. So I think SUDs, it says in 4, it says SUDs will be incorporated within new developments wherever possible and take opportunities to provide multifunctional benefits. This is the current belief, state of the art. Can that not be modified in some way, such as where it would be considered effective? Thank you.
Mr. Cloud, do you want to come in?
Yes, I did just want to address some of those points. The County Council support the policy as it is. On the biodiversity point, I do understand where Mr. Miller is coming from there, and that they're in the past and possibly some current SUD systems are not good for wildlife, but there is the opportunity for them to be, if they are designed properly and properly incorporated into the development. Also take the point that they are not the biodiversity panacea, and they shouldn't be looked at as that. They should be looked at as part of a whole. I also just wanted to point out that SUDs is not just one kind of drainage solution. It's an approach to drainage, so it doesn't necessarily mean infiltration into the ground. It may include other solutions such as attenuation and then controlled release of water. So Mr. Miller is right to say that infiltration may not be a good solution on soil which already tends to be wet, but there are other SUD solutions that may be more appropriate. It's an approach, not necessarily a singular solution to be applied blanket across all developments. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I'll take on board those comments when I look at the policy.
Thank you.
Madam, could I just add that in doing that, you'll also take into account, I think in particular, paragraph 167, item C of the NPPF, which effectively says development should only be allowed in areas at risk of flooding where, in the light of the assessment, it can be demonstrated that, and then item C is it incorporates sustainable drainage systems, plural, unless there is clear evidence that this would be inappropriate. And that reference to systems reinforces Mr. Clow's point that SUDS is effectively, it's a range of techniques. It's not a simply one particular mechanism which may be appropriate. and SUDS operates within a hierarchy of applying different solutions to different sites depending on what may be appropriate or not appropriate. So I think we would say that the policy captures sort of issues that both reflect national policy, but also includes recognition of what is appropriate, and also includes reference to taking into account biodiversity benefits where applicable.
Thank you. Well, that concludes all the questions and things I want to discuss on matter 7. I'd like to thank you all for your contributions. It's been a long session this over the 2 days, but thank you for bearing with it. Thank you for your contributions. I'll consider them all as I look at these policies. And other than that, the session is therefore concluded, and the next ones will be in a couple of weeks when we're looking at matters 3 and 4. Thank you very much.